Most national budgets are dry spreadsheets filled with incremental tweaks to tax brackets and infrastructure spending. But the latest budget release from the Australian Labor government has ignited an intense wave of public outrage. Critics analyzing the new spending programs are making a startling claim that the government has functionally declared an economic war on its own people. This accusation comes at a time when the Australian middle class is already under significant pressure, struggling to secure housing, grow their savings, and maintain their local communities. Inside Parliament House, the priorities seem to have shifted. This budget redirects over $1 billion toward foreign aid and specialized programs, even as financial incentives for local families are being actively dismantled. To understand why this document is being viewed as a betrayal, we have to look past the top-line figures and examine the budget across three distinct front lines. If the numbers in this document are accurate, they suggest a break in the financial social contract between the Australian state and its tax-paying citizens. The first front line is the aggressive redirection of domestic taxpayer wealth to international and foreign interests. This map shows where capital is landing: $550 million for climate-resilient infrastructure in the Pacific, $330 million for Indonesia, and $167 million to Nauru. Most notably, $64 million is carved out to recruit Papua New Guineans into the Australian Defence Force. Domestically, the spending highlights a clear disparity in support. The budget provides $124 million to Jewish lobbying groups and $25 million to Muslim communities, yet provides no equivalent funding for Christian community security. Furthermore, the government has allocated $68 million to provide HIV treatments for immigrants who aren't even eligible for Medicare, funded entirely by the people who are. When combined, these items suggest a hierarchy of priorities, where global optics and non-citizen services are actively funded at the direct expense of the broader domestic tax base. The second front line involves a direct shift in how the government handles the wealth that Australians try to build for themselves. For the average worker, long-term security depends on investing, taking hard-earned money and putting it into shares, real estate, or commodities to protect against inflation. For local investors, the path just became harder. The 50% capital gains tax reduction has been removed, penalizing citizens trying to grow wealth. Simultaneously, foreign billionaire corporations investing in Australia are granted an unrestricted tax-free status on their capital gains. This mechanism creates a tilted playing field. Local money is legally handicapped, while foreign corporate capital is subsidized to outbid Australians for their own country's assets. This tax shift is one of the clearest signs of an adversarial economic policy, one that works to price the domestic middle class out of their own economy. The final front line focuses on how the state treats its most vulnerable servants, the military veterans. The government is directing heavy investigative budgets towards its own ranks, including over $50 million for war crime inquiries in Afghanistan and $16 million to investigate sexual violence in the ADF. But look at the scale of support for the veterans themselves. This graphic weighs the $66 million in investigative funding against a strict $5,000 limit placed on mental health care for veterans, capping their access to the doctors and psychiatrists they need. Prioritizing the prosecution of former soldiers while strictly limiting their psychological recovery signals a deeply hostile stance toward those who sacrificed for the nation. When we combine the data from these three fronts, the foreign aid, the tax shifts, and the veteran caps, we see a structural pivot in Australia's national strategy. These policies work together to cement a dual-tiered economy, where the domestic citizenry is at a permanent disadvantage. The top tier is reserved for foreign corporations and international interests, who are tax-advantaged and heavily subsidized by the Australian people. The bottom tier is the domestic population, squeezed by new tax penalties and strictly limited social safety nets. Whether we call it a budget or an economic war, the math suggests that everyday Australians are now operating in an environment where their own leadership's financial engine is aligned against their prosperity.